It is no secret that this country is currently facing an opioid epidemic. In recent decades, overdose rates have skyrocketed up to about 72,000 to 80,000 deaths per year from overdoses alone. But did you know that this isn't the first time this country has faced an opioid epidemic? It's not the second time either. It's actually the third. Here's what the history looks like. In the early 1800s, this country was having a problem with alcohol. They were dealing with domestic violence and violence within the streets amongst the immigrants. So what they decided to do, the medical community comes together and makes a recommendation that people should start smoking opium as an alternative to alcohol. Their thought behind this was that it would be at least a safer alternative, and at least you won't beat your wife if you're smoking opium. You're more likely just to fall asleep. Well, what they didn't realize was that then you were going to have a country that was hooked on opium. Then in the mid-1800s, morphine is invented by a German scientist and brought over to the United States. First of all, it was recommended to people who were hooked on opium as a safer and non-addictive alternative to opium, which we now know is not true. It's highly addictive. Second, it was used during the Civil War to help treat people's injuries that they've inflicted from the battlefield. Obviously, the medical capabilities during that time weren't that great, especially on the battlefield. So they said, well, why don't we just numb the pain with morphine? It seems to work pretty well. But what a lot of people don't realize is that morphine was being prescribed widely by doctors throughout the United States to housewives. There was a belief during this time that women should not have to deal with pain. So if you had a menstruation cramp, if you had a headache, if you had anxiety, or if you couldn't sleep, they were prescribing morphine to tons of housewives. So throughout the country, we had thousands and thousands and thousands of housewives hooked on morphine. Now, somewhere within this time, the hypodermic needle was invented and people began to inject morphine. People would even have appointments with their doctor to go to their doctor to get their daily dose of morphine injected. Then the Bayer company came out with a solution to this problem that we were facing with morphine: heroin. Heroin was marketed as a safer and non-addictive alternative to morphine. Now, the funny part about that is that those studies that they said they did on rats that proved that it was safer and non-addictive haven't really been found, and no one's really going to ever know if they were even valid or not, or if they were ever even done. It probably just was some type of marketing strategy that they invented to try to sell heroin. So then heroin starts to be sold over the counter. Well, as you can imagine, this didn't end well, and this is how we found ourselves in the first opioid epidemic of this country. Overdose rates began to skyrocket in America as the lower classes discovered heroin. They realized they could buy it over the counter, crush it up, and snort it, and they'd get this desired high that they were looking for. They can escape for a few moments of the hardships of the early 1900s. Eventually, America had to deal with this problem, recognizing that there was this massive addiction issue, and they began creating laws that outlawed heroin and outlawed the improper use of morphine, which actually really helped for quite a while. Here's a little fun fact for you. For decades and decades, there's been this rumor going around that the wife of the inventor of the hypodermic needle, Alexander Wood, actually died from a morphine overdose. She was known as the first intravenous morphine-addicted person. Now, it turns out that this actually isn't true, and supposedly she outlived him. So then the country finds itself in its second opioid epidemic. Now, the second opioid epidemic affected a little bit of a different population than the first. The first epidemic really affected the entire population, starting from the upper class, moving down to the lower class. Now, this one was primarily targeted towards the lower class, and their opioid of choice was heroin, but not the same heroin that was sold on the streets in the early 1900s, late 1800s. This heroin was synthetically created street heroin. The country began seeing this enormous problem with the synthetic grade heroin that was being put out in the streets in the lower SES populations. So in response, they decided to treat people's heroin addictions using methadone. Methadone actually was also originally marketed as something that was safer and non-addictive. Eventually, we started to see some of the heroin addiction and overdose rates begin to decline after Vietnam War and moving into the 80s, primarily due to the invention of crack. That brings us all the way up to the current situation we're in now, the third opioid epidemic. This epidemic started with the invention of oxycontin by Purdue Pharma. Oxycontin is a very powerful opioid analgesic pain medication that was brought to the market around 1996. Now, how we got from the creation of oxycontin to where we're at today in this opioid epidemic, 25 years later, is a little bit complicated of a story, but it really all does start with Purdue Pharma. Purdue Pharma employed an essentially ingenious marketing scheme where they were telling people that oxycontin is the safe and non-addictive alternative to other opioid medications. Bullshit! They also marketed it towards the medical community, essentially telling doctors that if you do not give this pain medication, if you don't treat your pain patients with this medication, then you are not a compassionate doctor. They basically stated that it was the compassionate thing to do was that when you have a patient in pain, you treat them with this pain medication. Eventually, this led down a long road of overprescribing this pain medication. There was a lot of realizing that you can make a ton of money as a doctor by prescribing this highly addictive drug. And it led to a bunch of egregious behavior by doctors, the opening of pill mills, the shutting down of pill mills, a supply and demand problem when you have an enormous percentage of the population hooked on these oxycontin, these powerful opiate pills, opiate medication, and no longer can get those pills, then all of a sudden there is a supply and demand issue, like I said, which is leading them to find other alternatives to that pain medication to try to appease their withdrawals, essentially. So the price of oxycontin and the other type of pain medications that were out there, like roxicodone or other oxycodone-based drugs or diluted morphine-based drugs, really started to rise, and the price per pill really kept going up and up and up, to the point where all of a sudden dealers are offering their clients a cheaper and more effective option: heroin. Eventually, you start to see people from all walks of life hooked on heroin. You see the soccer mom, the working dad, the working mom. You see people from low economic backgrounds to some of the richest, wealthiest, and famous people hooked on heroin. The demand for heroin was so high, and dealers were looking for a way to reduce the price of the heroin, so they started mixing it with synthetically made fentanyl. Now, fentanyl is about 50 to 100 times stronger than heroin, and you need a much smaller amount to get the desired effect. And that is essentially why we are seeing such a huge amount of overdoses today. Fentanyl is really the culprit behind that. Oftentimes, though, people are polysubstance abusers. That means they're abusing more than one substance at a time. So mixing fentanyl with something like a benzodiazepine, like Xanax or Ativan, can really cause the respiratory system to shut down, which is essentially an overdose. So really, the creation of OxyContin in 1996 has triggered a series of events that have led us to where we're at today. Now, that's just one theory. Of course, they all start there, but then the theory is of how society looks for instant gratification in everything that we do, the invention of technology, the way that we communicate with each other these days, how pertinent cyberbullying has led to lower self-esteem rates. I mean, there's a lot of different theories as to why, and my belief is that it's not just one theory as to why we're in the situation we're in right now, but it's all of these combined has really created the perfect storm that would lead to something like an opioid epidemic or lead to the rise in substance use disorders.